Well, welcome in everyone to the Storycraft Cafe. I'm your host, Hank Garner, and today I'm super excited to have Don Bentley joining us on the show. Don has a resume that's as long as my arm, and we'll get into all the fun stuff on it in just a minute. But Don has a brand new book that's releasing on September 3rd, and it is the latest in the Vince Flynn Mitch Rapp series, and it's called Capture or Kill. And I have to tell you, Don, that over the last 10 years or so, um, I've become very good friends with Kyle Mills, who took
He's a
over
great
the
guy.
series. Yeah, who took over from Vince Flynn when Vince's untimely passing
Yeah.
happened, and we had this iconic character of Mitch Rapp, who had so many stories yet to be told, and
Mhm.
Kyle heroically stepped in there and continued that character and grew him, and to took the character to places that that we'd never imagined happening,
Yep.
and did that character justice. And
Yep.
I was talking to Kyle, I guess about a year ago, and he said, I'm passing the torch on Mitch Rapp, and he said I'm passing it to Don Bentley. And I said, oh, that's gonna be amazing. I can't wait to see what Don does with it. And so anyway, yeah, I got this about a month ago from your publicist, and it's phenomenal. I
Thank
can't
you.
believe, we've got this character that Vince, did amazing
Mhm.
things with, going on. I don't know, when did Vince begin? A couple of decades ago, almost. It feels like.
Yeah, he was one of the first post 9/11
Yeah.
thriller writers. And so I think his first one maybe came out right before or right around there, but
Yeah.
every single one of us that write in this genre owe a debt to Vince because
Right.
he was the first one. Brad Thor was shortly thereafter, but he was the first one that really came up with that idea of I'm gonna develop this iconic protagonist in Mitch Rapp who has a certain skill set that lets him hunt his nation's enemies on their home turf, and then go
Right.
shoot him in the face. And so he was unapologetic about that, and he
Right.
really changed the genre.
Yeah. You are no stranger to stepping into someone's
Yeah.
established world, because you did the same thing with Tom Clancy. I mean, Tom Clancy with Jack Ryan Jr., and
Mhm.
you wrote in that world. Um, Not to mention your own series and your own character that you have developed, and which amazing, the things that you've been able to create on your own, but then also
Thank you.
to morph into someone else's shoes, and
Yeah.
not only deliver a consistent story for what readers expect, but then to take it in new ways, and to stretch that character, and to
Yeah.
kind of pull our imaginations in new places. Let me just start with this. Um when you're developing a character and a world all of your own creating,
Mhm.
versus stepping into an established character, an established world with established rules and all that, how do you approach those two things? Because you have to come in with a completely different mindset, I would think. But what's the
Yeah.
first thing that you do when approaching a new project, either your own or an established?
No, that's a great question, and it's very pertinent to my story because I wrote so Without Sanction was my debut novel in my Matt Drake series,
Right.
and that sold in a
Drake
two
is
book.
such an incredible character.
Oh, thank you so much, thank you so much, and that sold in a two-book deal. But prior to Without Sanction, I wrote three books that didn't sell, and so the editor for my Matt Drake series, as well as the Tom Clancy books, is a guy named Tom Colgan, who
Yeah.
has edited everybody from Clancy when he was still alive to Lee Child and Mark Graney and Janet Ivanovich, just all of these incredible writers. And he
Yeah.
told me once that when you're a new writer trying to debut in any genre, but in particular the thriller genre, you have to do something that's the same but different. And so Brad Taylor is a great friend of mine. He writes the Pike Logan
Oh yeah.
books, and he's a New York Times bestselling author. And so hopefully the books, my Matt Drake books, should be shelved next to Brad's because we're in the same genre. But I'm never going to write a better Brad book than Brad does. And so what I really tried to do without Sanction is say, what are the things in this series that I can do that are a little bit different from what other people have already done in this genre? And so I made some choices like Nelson DeMille's a huge influence of mine. And so his John Corey character in particular, this witty first person, he writes it as a first person New York cop. I thought, there's a lot of people in this genre who write very good kind of barrel-chested, steely-eyed killers, but not very many that write a guy who fits that mold, but also has this self-depreciating sense of humor. And so I made some of those choices with my series to do that same but different. Now, when you're stepping into somebody else's series, it's a whole different ball game, as you alluded to, because you have a world that you didn't build, populated by characters that you didn't create. And so every writer approaches that a little differently. Kyle is a very analytical person when it comes to his writing. And so he's famous for doing these crazy detailed outlines that might run 40 or 50,000 words before he even writes the book. And to the point when Kyle and I were talking, he mentioned that he had actually, his first book was called The Survivor, his first book after Vince tragically passed away. And Vince's final book was called The Last Man. And so Kyle then wrote The Survivor, and he talks about how he studied Vince's language. And even now he would look at and say, how did Vince structure this sentence? How many times did Vince curse? How many times have I cursed? And so they're definitely Kyle Mills books, but he went above and beyond to try and change his organic writing style to more mirror Vince's. I'm kind of on the other side of the equation with that, in that, again, going back to my fantastic editor, Tom Colgan, when he gave me the Clancy gig, he said, listen, nobody can write like Tom Clancy. I don't expect you to write like Tom Clancy. I just want you to do what you're doing in the Matt Drake world, or do what you're doing in how you write Matt Drake, but write it as fan fiction in the Clancy universe. And so when I came to write in Vince's universe, I made a couple decisions. And so the first is Capture or Kill actually takes place in 2011, and it takes place in a gap of books where Vince stopped writing. He used to age his characters subsequently with each book. And so he did that until Pursuit of Honor. And then he took a break and went back and wrote American Assassin and Kill Shot, the two prequels. And then he came back to present day with The Last Man. And so there was that gap in time. And I decided to kind of jump into that. And so Capture or Kill takes place that. And so I read Vince's books over and over and over again, especially the two bookends, especially Pursuit of Honor and The Last Man, because I wanted to be able to explore the story further, but I had to make sure nothing I did would have ripple effects through the rest of the series. And so I spent a lot of time immersing myself in his language and how but more than trying to mirror his prose, more looking at how did he write Mitch? Like how was Mitch different when Vince wrote him than when Kyle wrote him, 10 years later after those subsequent books. And so I spent a lot of time trying to do that, but I knew I wasn't a good enough writer or gifted in the way that Kyle was to be able to try and analyze like Vince's sentence structure and do stuff like that. And so I didn't try to make any effort to mirror his voice. I just wanted to tell really good stories in the same manner in which he told them when he wrote them.
Well, if I remember right, Kyle has a history in finance, which probably helps his analytical, his approach to story. You have a history in the military and law enforcement. How do those skills that you picked up along those ways, how do those serve you as a writer?
Yeah, so I was lucky enough to spend 10 years as an Army Apache helicopter pilot, and did a tour of duty in Afghanistan as an air cavalry troop commander from 2005 to 2006. And then I got out and went into the corporate world for a little bit and wasn't quite ready for that. So I went in the FBI for a couple of years and was a special agent on one of the HUMINT squads and a SWAT team member for a couple of years too. And so I like to say, when Without Sanction came out, I was doing a radio interview, and the interviewer said, "Are you Matt Drake?" She said, "Are you your protagonist?" And while I assured her that I was indeed not Matt Drake, I did say that I've stood in the room with men who could be, and I think that is what my career post the FBI, especially until about 3 years ago, where I was able to write full time. I worked for a number of small companies whose customers were end users in the special operations or intelligence communities. And so I very much got to know people who could be Matt Drake or could be Mitch Rapp or could be Jack Ryan Jr. or any of the people that surrounded it. In fact, many of them are characters in my books because, I'd hear their stories, or just their real life stories were in many ways so much better than ones that I could write in a book. And so I would ask if I could use them as characters in my books. Now, because I'm a writer and I think it's funny, what I often did was change their branch affiliation. And so in my Clancy books, there's a Green Beret named Jad Mustafa, and Jad is a real person, but in real life, he was a Navy SEAL, and I made him a Green Beret because I think that's funny. Jad doesn't think that's funny, but I'm the writer and I get to do it and I want. And so by the same token, in Capture or Kill, there are a number of people who are friends of mine who really do the roles in those books. Excuse me. In fact, 3 of the characters in there that are Army Rangers, Jeff Mishler, Brandon Cates, and Greg Glass, are all friends of mine, and they were Rangers together in Afghanistan. And so that's one of the things that I like to do. On a more serious note, in my final Clancy book that's called Weapons Grade, I had the idea to use 2 veterans who tragically were killed. One of them was killed in Niger. The other one was killed in Syria as characters. And so I got their family's permission to do that. And so Shannon Kent, who's the wife of Green Beret Joe Kent, is a character in Weapons Grade. And then Isaac Black, who's a Green Beret in Weapons Grade. His father, Brian Black, was a Green Beret and was killed in Niger. And so I carried that forward in Capture or Kill, and that there's a character in the book who's a young Ranger company commander whose name is Mark Garner. And Mark in real life was my neighbor in Germany during my final assignment. He was Ranger qualified. He wasn't from the Ranger Regiment, but he was an infantry officer, and he was tragically killed in Afghanistan in an IED attack. And so I asked his widow if I could use his name in the book and explain why, and she very graciously agreed. Excuse me.
Yeah. I've got the same throat tickle going on today, Don. I had to get a piece of gum to wet my throat. So I understand. Yeah, I've heard. It's so funny that you say that someone asked you if you were Matt Drake, because it's so funny when you're writing. Of course, you put yourself in the story, in your characters. But what I find interesting is that rarely do people understand where you show up in your story. Like they just assume that you are the main protagonist, when in reality there's a little bit of you over in this character and there's a little bit of you over in this character, and you kind of get to farm out all of your traits across different people. Do you when you're thinking about your cast of characters, are you looking at ways to really humanize those characters, as far as their good traits and their bad traits? What do you think about when you're creating your supporting cast that go along with your protagonist?
Yeah. So in my Matt Drake series, Matt's sense of humor is very much mine, and kind of the way he looks at the world. And again, one of the same but different choices I made in that series is I decided to make him a happily married man, because most of the people I knew who could be Matt Drake were married, and that family kind of served as an anchor or a counterpoint to the sometimes very dark world that they inhabited in their real life scenarios. And so while Matt's wife is modeled after another friend of mine from a heritage and looks perspective, the way that she acts and reacts to Matt is very much my wife. And so with the Vince Flynn books, what I did, again, many of those characters already existed, but what I brought that was a little bit different, perhaps than a direction Kyle went, is I used a lot more, or leaned a lot more into the military humor, or the sense of humor that I saw when I served, that people who are in the special operations community, they have kind of a gallows sense of humor, and then they also rib each other very, very hard when they come from different branches of services. And so one of the more difficult things of writing in the Flynn books is my previous books, again, because I'm from the Army, the majority of my friends and coworkers are veterans of the Army Special Operations community. And so my previous Matt Drake and Tom Clancy books are just chock full of SEAL jokes, to the point where Brad Taylor at one point read my third book that was called Hostile Intent, and he said, "I think you might have crossed the Rubicon here. I think there might be too many SEAL jokes." And so Vince Flynn loves SEALs, and Scott Coleman is a huge character. And so I had to figure out, like, how am I going to flip that on its head a little bit? And so there's a sequence in Capture or Kill where Scott Coleman has to go rescue a stranded Army Ranger. And so the dialogue between the two, when the Army Ranger figures out that his rescuer is a Navy SEAL, was a lot of fun to write, and is actually reflective of some of the conversations I've overheard in the military, kind of in that inter-branch rivalry.
Yeah. When you think about thrillers, especially, the people kind of, I think, falsely assume that these are plot heavy books, and they are. And let me kind of explain what I mean by that. Because you have to have a scenario where everything goes terribly wrong, and someone has to save the day. That's what makes a thriller, is that the world is going to be lost if we don't figure out how to prevent this or whatever.
Yeah.
And yeah, that means you need to develop a great plot. But what really makes a thriller sing is its characterization, is that all of this bad stuff is happening to people, and to people that readers have learned to care about. So when you think character versus plot, how do you ensure that these characters have something that readers can love, can care about, and that it matters to them if the world going to hell happens to these people?
Yeah, that's a really insightful question, because kind of the stereotypical way people break down books are they plot driven or character driven?
Right.
And what they usually mean when they ask that question is kind of a snooty. On one hand, we have literary fiction that's completely character driven, and then on the other, perhaps we have genre fiction that only cares about the plot, and the characters are there to view the plot. And so the best of books combine both of those things.
Sure.
And I think, especially with thrillers, there's this really nifty trick when you read masters of the genre, like Daniel Silva, Lee Child, or stuff like that, is that that there is a steadily increasing set of stakes and stuff, right? That's another thing that thriller writers do very well, is they don't usually tell you in the first chapter that the safety of the entire world is at risk. It builds over time, kind of like that ticking time, so that the stakes get higher and higher and higher with every chapter, and it pulls you in. But the way you can only, especially if you write in a series, I think Daniel Silva is on his 23rd or 24th Gabriel Allon book. This is the 23rd, Capture or Kill is the 23rd Mitch Rapp book, 24th book total that Vince wrote, or that is in Vince's universe, because his first book, Term Limits, didn't have Mitch Rapp in it. But so you could only threaten to destroy the world so many times in that series before readers get numb to it. And so the people who are very, very good at this, that are masters, the way that they increase the stakes is what they really do is they make you care about the characters. And so if you're a father, you take the movie Taken and your daughter has been kidnapped, it doesn't make a difference whether the world is ending or not, because your world is going to end if something bad happens to your daughter. And so I think that's one of the great ways where characters overlap with plot, is you make the readers care so much about the characters that it can be a character's in danger of getting hit by a bus. And that has just as much emotional impact as the bad guy's about to explode a nuclear weapon in the middle of downtown DC, right? Because for those readers, they're so invested in the character, that is their world and they care about it. I think the second thing is characters, especially in series thrillers, are what keep you coming back book after book after book. Like there's, again, to use Daniel Silva, he has this famous interaction in almost every book where Gabriel Allon has to go head to head with this crazy goat in Sicily. And so it's this goofy thing that he throws in, but readers absolutely love it because it's a side of a character you don't usually see. And it's kind of this behind the curtain nod to the people who really get, here's the scene you've been waiting for. And I think that's what drives great series, are characters that readers want to know what happened to from book to book to book. And that's what brings them back for, like I said, in Vince Flynn's case, for his 23rd Mitch Rapp book and his 24th book overall.
Right. I've had this conversation with Brad Thor a couple of times, and because when you've got a long running series character, like Brad does, or like we have with Mitch Rapp, yes, you're absolutely right that it doesn't matter if the world is coming to an end. If Mitch is in trouble, that's what we care about. We want Mitch to be okay. Well, when you get up to the 23rd Mitch Rapp book, and we assume there's going to be a 24th Mitch Rapp book. We've got an iconic character, an iconic franchise. We want more. We want more. Inherently, what comes with that is that we assume that Mitch is going to be okay at the end of the book. So knowing all that, how do you keep the tension ratcheted up and make the stakes real and tangible, knowing that we're, next summer we're probably going to have another Mitch Rapp book? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's another great question. And I went about it a couple ways. And so the first one being, Mitch Rapp is such an iconic protagonist and is a larger than life protagonist that if you, especially 23 books in, if you stack Mitch up against any one person, the reader might think it's kind of like watching Jack Reacher go to town on a couple of people, right? Know that he's going to elbow a guy, he's going to stomp on somebody's kneecap, he's going to headbutt him, but he's probably going to be all right. And so what I tried to do is say, how do you, if you concede the fact to the reader that one-on-one Mitch Rapp is probably going to be okay against a single adversary or a single situation, what can you do to have things happening all over the world or in two different places that he physically can't be at and has to choose between which presents the greatest threat right now? It's almost like if you can have somebody wrestle one bear and know they're going to come out in the head, what can you do to have them run into, a herd of bears or whatever that would be called, right? To give them, to stack the odds against them in a way that the reader buys into and says, holy cow, like Mitch can't be in two places at one time. Mitch can't do all of this at the same time, how, and I think that's one way. And another way that I leaned into a little bit more in this book is by writing scenes with Mitch in them, but having them through the eyes of someone else. Because what that does, when you're in Mitch's head, Mitch is supremely confident. And so that subconsciously takes down the stakes a little bit for the reader, because if Mitch feels okay about it, they probably do. And so there are a bunch of scenes. Some of them I actually wrote originally from Mitch's point of view and thought, no, I could make this more suspenseful if I had it from another character's point of view, who either, number one, it lets me reveal some pretty neat things about Mitch that you're seeing through their eyes. And number two, maybe they don't think Mitch has got this all wired together. And so you start to get the doubt and is he going to be able to pull this through or not from their perspective? And so you really have to be able to do more of those inside baseball writer tricks for that reason, because otherwise it can get, I'm a kid of the 80s. And so I use this example a lot. I loved the A-Team when I was 10 years old. And so when that series came out on Netflix, my own kids started watching it and I was so pumped, but they only watched it for about 3 days. And I'm like, why did you stop? And they're like, because the same thing happens at every single point of the episode. And they no longer felt that there was risk there, right? That there were things at stake, that people could get hurt, that it would go sideways. And so you have to, my first editor, again, gave me one of the best compliments I ever received with one of my Jack Ryan Jr. books. And he said, I know in my head that Jack has to make it out by the end of this book, but there were points in here where my heart wasn't so sure. And I think that's what you have to do. Reading is all about suspending your disbelief anyway. But when you're writing these iconic protagonists, you have to figure out a way to take that further and get the reader to suspend their disbelief about the protagonist and think, maybe this just might be the last Mitch Rapp book. Who knows?
Right. Well, you mentioned Jack Reacher a minute ago, and I asked Lee Child a variation of that question one time, and he said, well, there are things that I can do to Reacher that are much worse than death. And, and I was like, well, touche there, I can see that. You rewound the clock on this book and you went back to 2011, I believe it was. What did that allow you to do to fit the story kind of into the timeline that already exists? Did that give you some freedom to kind of have some guardrails for feeling out this character and kind of getting into the world? Did that ease you in, so to speak?
Yeah, I think I did it for a couple of reasons. And so selfishly, kind of like what we talked about before, almost wanted to have Vince's training wheels on the first book that I wrote, right? And so Kyle is a fantastic writer and was never content to just turn in, here's the next episode of Mitch Rapp. And so he didn't just tread water. He took the series an entirely new and oftentimes surprising direction. But the consequences of that are there's some of the fan favorite characters who aren't here anymore. And so by going back to 2011, I could bring some old faces back who had since passed on and tell the stories with them, which I thought was fantastic. It also let me write a much more visceral Mitch than potentially what he is, 10 or 12 years later. And then the final part is that I read a lot of Vince Flynn books when I was in Afghanistan. And so almost everywhere you were, whether it was the gym and then they had formal libraries, they were these little like informal lend libraries where people would just stack paperbacks and you could grab one or put them. And so in my mind, for whatever reason, Vince Flynn has always been kind of associated with Afghanistan because I read so many of his books there. And so when I was looking again at that period of time that he left open when he went back and wrote the 2 prequels, and I saw 2011, it took me back to being an FBI agent in Dallas. And I remember standing in my living room and watching President Obama walk out to the podium and say, "We killed Osama bin Laden." And my first thought was, it's about time we took that guy off the face of the earth. And then my second thought was, I wonder what Mitch Rapp had to do with that. And I said it kind of tongue in cheek, but I think that's a question that Vince Flynn fans have been asking themselves for the last 13 years is, what role did Mitch Rapp have to do with the bin Laden raid, and I get to be the guy that answers it, which was a ton of fun. And so when I kind of came up with that idea for the book, I went to Vince's website because he has a bunch of questions where people
Mhm.
used to write in and he would answer them to see if people had ever talked to him about that. And so there was at least one question where a fan had said, "Hey, what do you think Mitch did during this raid?" And Vince gave kind of a vanilla answer where he said, I'm sure there were a lot of CIA officers on the ground kind of setting the conditions for that raid. And that's probably something of what Mitch did. And so that really, as I started researching it, a lot of folks through Zero Dark 30 and other things know kind of about the macro level hunt for bin Laden, and certainly the
Mhm.
micro level of the SEALs coming into that compound and taking him out. But I started pursuing more of like, what were folks doing to set the conditions for that? What do we think CIA officers on the ground were doing? And that led me to some really intriguing things that kind of became the backbone for Capture or Kill.
I love it. Folks that don't read a lot of thrillers or maybe don't quite understand the genre, I've never given it a chance or
Mhm.
whatever. Um, I think a lot of people just assume that it's just white knuckle all the time,
Yeah.
and people are like, I'm really not in for that much adrenaline, in my
Yeah.
entertainment. But what people overlook sometimes or maybe don't give a chance, um, is the fact that to really craft a great thriller, you really need some moments of levity.
Yeah.
You need to let the reader off the hook every
Yep.
now and then. Let their adrenaline come down. Let them feel a sense of normalcy so that when you do ratchet that tension back up, it hits harder because
Yeah.
they get the full range of emotion. It's like, roller coasters aren't just all, straight down the whole time.
Yeah.
You have you give the reader a break every now and then. Do you think about kind of the ebb and flow of the thriller and how you really have the reader's emotions in your hand and how you're guiding them and the ups and downs and all that? How do you think about kind of the flow of the story and what you're getting to do with the reader?
Yeah, I think you have to do that. Otherwise, kind of to your point before, you end up burning the reader out, right? Because
Yeah,
they can't take it anymore, or you can't raise the stakes anymore. And so then what it becomes is kind of, I liken it to the John Wick movies. Like Keanu Reeves is one of my favorite actors, but 5 minutes into that movie, he's already killed 30 people. And I'm like, okay. And so does that 31st person he killed really have any significant emotional weight?
right.
Probably not, right? Because there were 30 people before that he stacked up already. And so I think when you're writing a thriller, you have to be very intentional about those beats and when you decide to play with the reader and ratchet up the tension and when you let it fall back down. And the way I learned how to do that was from Vince Flynn. And so, like I said before, I wrote 3 books that didn't sell before I learned enough of my craft to write one that did. And so when my second or third book didn't sell, I took my favorite Vince Flynn book, which is Protect and Defend, and I note carded it out. And so I used a different note card for every scene, every chapter, and a different color note card for every point of view character. And we lived in a little tiny house then. And so I taped all of those note cards to our bedroom wall. And so my wife was less than thrilled about that. But like what that allowed me to do was kind of the difference between looking at a building and looking at the blueprints of the building. And so
Sure.
suddenly on that wall in colors, I could see how many chapters does Vince go before he brings Mitch back in? How many I think it was little stars or something. Every note card that there was a fight scene or a gun battle, I'd put a star on it. And then you'd say, okay, how many chapters or how many scenes does he go in between these conflicts? Or when it is, how many chapters does he string that together? And so you start to learn. When people ask me all the time, how do you be a writer? I'm like, you got to write a lot and you got to read a lot. And you have
Right.
to read specifically in the genre that you're trying to write in, because you have to learn the conventions of that genre at a gut level, at an instinctive level, so that now when I write, I kind of have a sense for, I need this to build for something, and then I need to give a couple chapters for it to spool back down again. And you can also, I'm also a big fan of the save the cat beats. I
Sure.
don't use it. I write more organically, so I don't know the scenes ahead of time, but I know if I'm writing in act one, that I'm steering towards an inciting event and then a
Sure.
debate and then a break into two. And so even if I don't know what those scenes are, I kind of have them in the back of my mind. And then what I'll do once I have a first draft done is to lay the beats, the save the cat 3-act beats out on the note cards. I go through note cards like nobody's business. And I lay them all over my office floor and move them around and try and rip them up and write new ones and stuff. But that allows me to do that of how you, as a thriller writer, you have to do two things. You have to control the amount of tension that you're exposing the reader to and when, and you also are always controlling the flow of information that a reader gets when, right? Because in a great book, what's happening is that the reader's discovering what's going on at about the same time as the protagonist, maybe a little bit afterwards. Maybe the protagonist has it figured out first, or they do it together. And so both of those things are really, really important, because even though a thriller isn't a mystery, you don't want them to know at the end of chapter one,
Right.
here's all the stakes, here's what's going to happen, here's what the bad guy is. And so you have to be really, really good to do that on the fly. Most people, I think that's why Kyle does these crazy big outlines. And in my case, I figure it out as I go. But what that means is my rewriting process is probably much more rigorous than Kyle,
Yeah.
because there's so many scenes that I have to redo or mess with or take out or things of
Yeah.
that. But that's kind of the difference between, basic level and then graduate level of writing a book that people are going to pay money for.
Well, I absolutely love it. Capture or Kill is a must buy in your late summer thriller reading. It comes out in 2 weeks from yesterday. I think it was
Yeah.
September the 3rd.
September 3rd.
Um,
Yep.
yeah, everywhere that great books are sold, go pick up a copy. We'll put links to it in the show notes as well, where you can grab it from Amazon or Audible. If you don't have an excellent local bookstore, support local books if you can. If not, use the links that we provide. Don, I had so much fun reading this book. I absolutely love what you are doing with the
Thank you.
series and the character and the new direction, or not necessarily a new direction, but adding some new flavor to an already excellent series. I love what you're doing with it. Can't wait to see what's coming in the future. With this book coming out, if we know anything about the publishing industry, this has probably been off of your desk for quite a while now. As we go through the machinations of the publishing industry, what are you working on these days?
Yes, I'm normally working on a couple things at the same, or I have a couple things on my plate. I try not to work on more than one, because I'm fortunate enough that I usually have more opportunities than I have time to write. And
Yeah.
so when I turned Capture or Kill in for edits, I started working on a standalone that's going to come between the last book in my Matt Drake series, that was Forgotten War, and then whatever the fifth one is. And then I'm also put that aside now, and I'm working on my next Mitch Rapp book. So I'm about a quarter of the way into that right now.
Ah, so exciting. So exciting. So do you think we'll see a late summer release next year for the
Yeah, they
next Mitch
normally
Rapp?
like to keep that same September. So that's what I would guess, but I don't set those. The publishing gods do.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Well, I absolutely love what you've done with the series and where you're taking it. Can't wait to see what comes next. Don, if people are just discovering you and want to dig into all the great
Yeah.
stuff that you're up to, what's the best place for them? What's a central location on the web where they can find out all about Don Bentley and what's going on?
Sure. So it's real easy. My website is donbentley.books.com. It's Bentley. You can sign up for my newsletter there. You can email me there. Also, if you're a social media person, I'm on Facebook Instagram, and X, and my handle is the same for all three. It's at Bentley Don B. So BentleyDonB.
Excellent. We'll link up all that to make it easy for folks to find you.
Awesome.
Don, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.